Welcome back. This is Chapter 5, Planning for People. I'd like to start by taking a look at Figure 5-1 in the chapter. So let's take a moment, if you haven't already done so, and even if you have, do a refresher. Take a look at this figure that I'm putting on the screen. See what kind of conclusions and ideas you can get from that pyramid and that graphic. One thing that came to my mind was I thought it's unlikely that you'll delight customers by exhorting employees to do so. In other words, we can go around and telling them, begging, pleading, exhorting employees a lot, saying it's really important that we delight our customers, but we've really got to have some of the driving forces in the organization that will help us do that. In other words, we need to identify what it is that will help us set up the work practices and behaviors that will delight customers. So that's one thing I like about that graphic. And I think that's the base of the pyramid. The portion in dark green is thinking about what kind of practices can we as managers bring to bear in the organization that will help us achieve that high level of quality or customer service. So the human resource practices we'll talk about this semester certainly will help us achieve that. Also related to that portion of the pyramid, particularly what work practices support high performance, consider the core job characteristics discussed in the chapter. Those are skill variety, task identity, task significance, autonomy, and feedback. Those are very important characteristics, and I'll put another diagram up here on the screen for you to look at. Let's take a moment and look at this diagram as well. This graphic shows how those job characteristics foster positive psychological states leading to positive outcomes. In other words, it shows how the core job characteristics affect employees and affect the outcomes that we're interested in. So I would say think about, as a manager, what practices you could make greater use of to achieve those so-called critical psychological states among employees. So those 5 core dimensions are quite important, and they're included in almost any management textbook that you would find. I would like to add to Hackman and Oldman's core dimensions, I'd like to add, if you will, Gilbreth's core dimensions. So I'm going to cover 4 other job features that are, I think, critically important to how work affects employees and how employees respond to the work. I'd like to start with the first one is job control. So job control is the extent to which employees control various aspects of their work, right? So the name pretty much says what it is, job control. How much control do I have over my work as an employee? If you think about it, related back to the 5 core dimensions, job control overlaps quite a bit with autonomy. So it's pretty similar. I think of job control as being multifaceted. As an employee, do I get to decide which task I do in which order? Do I get to choose the methods that I use? Do I get to arrange my workplace the way I would like to? Do I kind of set my own schedule to some extent about when I'm performing various tasks? So there's a lot of different facets of job control that determine whether my job control is high or low. Research is absolutely clear on this, that workers in low control jobs are less healthy than workers in high control jobs. So this is why I think this is a critically important job component for you to be familiar with. You need to think about the level of job control that your employees can handle, and then once you determine that they are able to handle more job control, it's probably wise to grant as much job control as you can. Back to the effects on health and well-being. Lack of control. If you think about it, why would people in high control jobs be healthier than people with low job control? Well, low job control is generally going to be stressful and unrewarding. When you have little decision-making authority, when you're told exactly how to do your job, can't exercise much autonomy or discretion or decision latitude, it's generally not a very psychologically rewarding state. So I think to treat employees more as adults coincides with giving greater levels of job control. The second dimension I would like to talk about is role overload. So this is basically having too much work to do in the time available. I'm sure as students you can relate to this. I think role overload is very common in, at least in the U.S. workplace today, having too much to do in the time available. A lot of people feel overloaded. So that would be quantitative overload, where the quantity of work is too high. There's also, sometimes you run across the term qualitative overload, and that's when the work is so complex that it's a stressor. I'm using the term stressor. A stressor is something that causes stress. Although occasional bouts with role overload pretty much are unavoidable. In other words, in almost any job there's going to be certain instances where a lot of activities come to a head in the schedule where you're realistically going to encounter role overload. But if it's chronic role overload, where week after week there's just too much work to do in the time available, you can imagine the effects it would have on employees. So I think certainly as managers you would want to watch out for the workload of your employees and whether they're feeling this role overload. I could share research results on all of these factors that I'm going to talk about. I will, just as an example, give you some idea of the various outcomes that have been correlated with role overload. So research has shown that, for example, that role overload is correlated with heavy smoking. So if people smoke, when they're experiencing role overload, they smoke more, which we know would have bad effects on health. It's correlated with elevated serum cholesterol, so some of the hormones going through the system that aren't healthy to be circulating in the bloodstream are higher cholesterol, hypertension or elevated blood pressure, increased heart rate, job dissatisfaction, lower quality of performance, and feelings of tension, anger, and personal failure. You may have experienced some of those yourself when you were having role overload. For me, I think that last one, the feelings of tension, not necessarily anger, but personal failure. When you just have work piled on you and you never see the end, it's hard to complete anything, and it's hard to gain that sense of accomplishment. So it does affect job satisfaction levels at that point. Next factor I wanted to discuss is social support. This is huge, a huge work factor. It's a huge life factor, quality of life factor, and health factor. So people who have higher levels of social support are healthier than people with lower levels of social support. So what is social support? We generally think of that as two types: emotional support and instrumental or tangible support. I think emotional support is what most of us initially think of when the term social support is used. So this would be, emotional support would include things like listening, showing that you care, providing moral support. So for example, a coworker's having a tough day or dealing with a difficult colleague or customer, that's when we could listen, empathize, show that we're concerned that the coworker's having a rough day, and that in and of itself helps the coworker deal with that more effectively. In the sense that, hey, I understand that somebody knows I'm having a rough day, somebody cares, I feel better now that I've talked about it. So that would be emotional support. Instrumental support, the other type that I mentioned, is also sometimes called tangible support. Tangible is touchable. That means you're doing something to help, right? You're actually pitching in, whether you're giving information, joining in on the task. So here you're not kind of talking to the coworker and saying, so you're having a rough day, tell me about it. That's emotional support. This is like, what can I do to help? I remember an incident where I was trying to prepare, I think it was for some kind of important presentation or task at work, and I was running up against a deadline, and it seems like, I don't know if you all have experienced this, but copy machines, they can read your mind, so they're most likely to break down or quit working correctly when you're up against a tight deadline. And I was having difficulty getting things copied and getting quite stressed as the deadline approached. And a coworker saw that I was having trouble, and she didn't come over and try to offer me emotional support. She pitched in and helped me figure out how to get that machine going again, and I really appreciated that. This is probably coming up on 20 years ago, and I still remember that incident. So I think what I'm saying is I'm not downplaying emotional support. It is extremely important. What I'm saying is it's important to match the type of social support to the situation and what the other individual needs or wants. Typically, I don't go into too many gender issues in this course or stereotypes, but oftentimes I found through my own experience that particularly with men, we like to offer instrumental support when sometimes it would be wiser to give emotional support. So say that you can think of coworkers, I'm going to relate it to a significant other or spouse. Significant other comes home from a difficult day at work and says, you know, I had a really rough day. They did this at work, and then my boss did that. I think I'm a fairly typical male in the sense, because I've talked to other males and females about this topic. We tend to want to jump in and say, well, you should tell them this, or you can't let them do that. What you should do is, when a lot of times what the other individual wants is just to be understood. Most people can figure out their own solutions, or if they can't, they will ask for advice on solutions. So I think all of us, whatever the gender, have to try to match the social support to what's wanted, and some of us in particular have to focus a little bit more on the listening side of the emotional support rather than trying to jump in and solve problems prematurely. I'd like to talk about the last of my so-called core dimensions, the Gilbreth core dimensions, is supervisor behavior. I can't help but throw this one in here because this is my research area, and I have documented, as well as other people, numerous other people have documented the huge effects bosses, managers, supervisors can have on the people reporting to them. In other words, the people working for them. So supervisors are important influences, not only on employee performance and motivation, but on their well-being, their health. I think it's important to point out that considerate supervision is a fundamental component of a psychologically healthy work environment. What do I mean by considerate supervision? Just consideration, being a decent human being to work for, listening, trying to give advance notice of upcoming events, trying to protect your employees from stressors or unfair treatment. As I say, asking for opinions, being participative, listening. When we're in a bad mood as the boss, trying to modify that or contain it to the extent that we don't lash out on our employees. Just considerate supervision, highly, highly important to employee well-being. Even if you're an effective boss on the technical side and the task and the structuring issues, which is very important, certainly, no doubt, your employees will be less healthy if you neglect the humane side of supervision. So they're both important, being technically proficient, structuring the work, all that planning, but you really can't neglect the considerate side of supervision. I think fundamental supervisor behavior such as planning and delegation also are associated with employees' job stress and psychological well-being. So you gotta, as much as you can, be the considerate, nice boss, but you also gotta do your job. You've gotta plan, delegate, take care of your own task as boss, or you will cause stress on your employees. So bosses that don't plan ahead, that just kind of use that firefighting mentality, running from one fire to another without stopping, trying to get organized, they cause a lot of stress for employees too, and that just wears them down. We've got employees in place to do a given task, and we need to manage our influence on them so that they can more or less concentrate and do what they need to do and go home at the end of the day feeling somewhat healthy and not beat down or so stressed that they can't even recover that evening. Okay, so really I think the managerial implication on all that is that it would be helpful to assess the work environment for those dimensions, and now you know of 9 factors that you could monitor. Hackman and Oldman's 5 core dimensions, and then the 4 that I've added. Those are pretty powerful influences on employees, and those are things you could check in your own behavior, and even if you wish to do more, work with consultants or professors to come up with ways of measuring the extent to which these positive factors are prevalent in your workplace. I wanted to mention a few other things related to Chapter 5, one of which is succession planning. I think this is often overlooked in organizations, figuring out who's going to move into certain key positions if and when somebody leaves. In fact, I know it's often overlooked in organizations. I've seen it happen. Casio does a good job of describing why it takes place in some instances, particularly at the CEO level, but I really think it's so important, not just at that level. I've seen an organization that was, or at least the plant manager that I knew was, I don't want to say in a state of panic, but extremely concerned because a blue-collar employee, a technical plant, lower-level employee, was leaving, I think for a job for more pay was the instance, and this was a key technical employee. In other words, this employee knew how to fix equipment nobody else knew how to fix. And so they really hadn't thought through if this guy left or was leaving, but what if, it could have just as easily been hurt in a car accident, had a medical problem. So really need to think through succession planning, and probably not just at the white collar positions or managerial positions, but all key positions. Who would fill it if somebody left? So it's just really important. And the way I think about it is think about sports, think about coaches. It would be absurd if a coach didn't know, say I'll use an American football analogy, if the quarterback, which often happens, gets hurt in a game and the coach is sitting there thinking, I wonder who I should put in next. I'm not sure, I haven't really thought about this. It's absurd. So that's a little bit of an exaggerated example, but I don't think sports are as earth-shatteringly as important as some of these corporations, and the effects they have on people's lives certainly can be important, but it's just crazy that we don't do more succession planning in organizations. One of the tools that will help with that is called a replacement chart. So if you haven't seen a replacement chart before, you might put that term into Google, maybe Google Images, and look at, or the search engine of your choice, and look at what replacement charts look like. These kind of are diagrams that lay out key positions and then who could move into that position either immediately or later. Sometimes they show the level of readiness to move into that position. So it kind of helps you gain a better idea of where your vulnerabilities are in the organization. I think also one of the keys to effective staffing is back to job analysis, studying what's important in terms of knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics for the given positions, identifying those, capturing them in a job specification, and then using that to inform staffing decisions. I think if you do job analysis, the key is, or as typical managers in finance, operations management, marketing, and so forth, you may not do job analysis, but you could do quick and dirty job analysis before you fill one of your own positions. You could lay out those categories: knowledge, skills, abilities, other characteristics, willingness, the willingness that employees must have for a given position, or the types of motivation. Lay those things out in your own mind, and then get some input from some other knowledgeable co-workers about that given position, and maybe customers as well. Identify what you need. I think really the key is, whoever's doing the job analysis, it's important to do multiple methods. So at least 2, hopefully 3 different methods. Things like the critical incident technique, questionnaire methods, interviewing job incumbents, customers, and bosses. There's a variety of methods that can be used to identify those important behaviors and skills necessary for success in a job. And it's just kind of like when the space scientists explore space, they use multiple methods. So when they look out at the universe, they might use X-ray telescopes, they might use radio telescopes, optical telescopes, infrared. It's interesting if you've ever looked at the various pictures that these different methods produce. Each of those methods uncovers unique information that the others don't, and when you combine those pictures, space exploration, you get an amazingly much more complete understanding of the universe. Same is true with job analysis. So several different methods will get you a lot better insight than one method only. I think planning for people, the substance of this chapter, really can be an ethical issue as well. I think it is extremely important for organizations and for managers to plan conservatively and carefully. So when there's an upswing in business, do we just hire people left and right, or do we kind of proceed cautiously? Can we use temporary employees? Can we temporarily increase the number of hours that our existing employees work? We have to be very careful, because I've seen instances where organizations have lured, organizations experiencing growth or success have lured employees from other stable jobs that they had into the company, and then found out, whoops, we didn't realize that that market wasn't going to work out, or that we overstaffed, and they let these people go, and these people can't go back to their prior jobs. So it can be some real stress and heartache in these instances. So I really think it's an ethical issue. You need to plan conservatively for staffing issues, particularly for increasing the size of the workforce. Using temporaries and contractors and things of that nature will help you expand. And then when it's pretty darn clear that additional employees are needed, then it's probably safe to go ahead and hire.